Hello, and thank you for joining me for Storytime with Mr. C. I am Mr. C, and if you've been here before, welcome back. If this is the first time you have tuned in to the show, welcome. If you like what you hear, please go check out my first 13 episodes. Here on Storytime with Mr. C, I will be sharing stories that I have written, or a friend or family member has written, or maybe even something you have written. If you would like for me to share one of your stories here on Storytime with Mr. C, get your story or stories ready to go and shoot me an email at storytimewithmisterc@gmail.com. I have put that email down in the description for you, and for now I'm going to ask that you please keep stories to a maximum of 2,000 words, and please keep them family-friendly, folks. And maybe, just maybe, I will read your story or stories in future episodes. As always, a big, huge thank you goes out to my buddy Russ for helping me out with my intro music. Russ is the bassist for local band Drive By High Five. If you can check them out one of these days, go do it, folks. I highly recommend. Also, as always, a huge thank you to Ben over at Chasing the Whimsy. You can find the link to his podcast down in the description. So please go show Ben some love and check out Chasing the Whimsy. Thank you again, Ben, and always for your continued support, sir. It is very much appreciated. Well, folks, I hope you enjoyed last week's episode, which was the final chapter from Father Allen. That's all I've got, folks, at least for now. As I've stated, Father Allen is still a work in progress, so there could always be more chapters down the line somewhere. Who knows? We shall see. But for now, we are moving on with a full month of spooky stories. It is officially October, the best time of the year, and spooky stories are in order. So, for this, our 14th episode, I will be sharing our next spooky story, or more specifically, the first half of our next spooky story. This one ran a bit long, folks, so I have broken it into 2 parts for you. So you will have to tune in next week to see how it all turns out. All right, folks, enough babbling. Here we go with episode 14. Stand by.
Storytime with Mr. C.
Storytime. Thank you once again for joining me for this episode of Storytime with Mr. C. This is the first half of my third spooky story. This is Wild Within, Part 1. Dan stood roughly 20 feet from the edge of State Route 97, another sad victim of too much soda. The low brush provided little privacy from the occasional passing vehicle, but he kept his back to the road and hoped to avoid any unwanted attention. He finished his business, put himself back together, and returned to his Toyota Tacoma, which sat idling on the shoulder. The sounds of Ian Curtis warbling on about being torn apart by love leaked from the truck as it sat in the early morning sun. Dan hoisted himself into the driver's seat, buckled in, and cracked open a fresh Baja Blast. "This stuff is going to kill me," he said to himself as he took a large swig of the frosty beverage. He flipped on his blinker, pulled back onto the road, and headed north. After another hour of driving, a 2-hour ferry trip up a narrow river, and 90 minutes of hiking, Dan found himself in an isolated area of the North Cascades. A wide variety of conifers and deciduous trees spread in every direction, and distant snow-capped peaks stretched to the sky. The air was crisp and clean, but also thinner than single-ply toilet paper. Dan was making progress, but found the struggle to breathe was more intense than the last time. No worries, though. He knew that he would acclimate quickly and all would be smooth sailing eventually. Dan made his way higher into the mountains as the sun crept ever closer to the horizon, and he eventually decided that setting up camp needed to happen sooner than later. He found a small clearing surrounded almost entirely by trees and within 20 yards of a burbling stream. This would do just fine. Dan was no stranger to the great outdoors, and he had been in the Cascades before, but never quite this far. This was the first time he had taken the ferry, and the first time he felt truly isolated from the outside world. But he also firmly believed that an occasional bout of discomfort was necessary for the goodness of the soul. Setting up camp was almost all muscle memory at this point, and with some minor adjustments based on proximity of trees and terrain specifics, Dan was kicked back in his favorite camp chair, enjoying a delightfully toasty mug of split pea soup in no time. The canopy of trees offered a nicely framed window for some stargazing, the stillness of the forest broken only by the occasional sounds of insects and other nocturnal critters. The cool wind whipped through the clearing and gave voice to the trees as they rustled in response. Dan slurped up the last of his soup, rested his mug on his belly, and let his eyes fall close. He would sleep well tonight, which was a good thing because the real work started tomorrow. He thought about crawling into his tent, but the camp chair was surprisingly comfortable, and he didn't really want to move just yet. And that is when the screaming began. Dan's eyes shot open and his heart broke into a slow trot. Was that a scream? Out here? Probably just an owl. Dan sat back and listened, but nothing happened, and his eyelids became heavy again. Another scream, and that was definitely not an owl. It was at a distance, but Dan could have sworn it was closer than the first one. He swung out of his camp chair, placed his mug on a nearby rock, and plucked Black Betty from where she had been leaning against a tree. Black Betty was Dan's hunting rifle, and while she didn't look like much, in the hands of the right person, she could take down a grizzly with a single shot. Dan slipped Betty's sling over his shoulder as another scream came through the trees. They were getting closer. He checked that his buck knife was still at his waist as he moved into the shadows. He stood silently, his hands wrapped around Betty, waiting for whatever came next. Another scream, but this one included a word. Dan could now tell that it was a man, and this man was screaming for help. Dan considered his options and made a choice. He hurried to his single lantern, moved it to the farthest edge of the clearing, and turned up the brightness. He knelt down behind the lantern, removed his buck knife, and smacked it several times against the nearest tree. "Here!" he hollered in the direction of the screams. "Over here!" He returned the knife to its sheath, hoisted Betty into the ready position, and slowed his breathing. More screams sounded from the darkness. "Hello? Is someone there? Please?" "Here!" Dan hollered again. "Follow my voice. Look for the light." "Oh, God," came the response. "Please, help me." Whomever was close enough now that Dan could hear them crashing through the trees. They should reach the clearing right about... A man erupted from the trees and slid to a stop in the clearing. He raised his arm to shield his eyes from the light of the lantern, but continued staggering forward. "Stop there," Dan shouted. "Who are you?" "What?" the stranger asked. I just need... "I said stop," Dan repeated. "I have a gun pointed at you, and I would really rather not have to use it." The man froze in his tracks. "Put your arm down," Dan commanded. The man complied and squinted against the light. Dan could now see that the man was young, maybe early 20s. He was wearing a set of thermal underwear, a flannel shirt, and socks. No shoes. And it looked like the trees had done a number on the poor guy. His clothes were torn in multiple places, and many of the tears were smeared with blood. But it was more than just that. The lower half of his face, his chest, and most of both arms were absolutely drenched with blood. "Who are you?" Dan asked again. My name is Philip," the man responded. "Philip Cosgrove. I'm nobody, a student." "Why are you here?" I heard you. I saw your light." "I gathered all that, Phil. Why were you screaming for help?" "I'm being chased," Philip said, looking behind himself. "Doesn't look like it," Dan replied. "If anyone was chasing you, they'd have come through those trees by now." "Are you armed, Phil?" "What?" was all the man could say. "Are you armed? Do you have any weapons?" I don't even have my shoes." "That's not what I asked, Phil." No. I don't have any weapons, okay? I'm not armed. Very good, Dan said. Why don't you have a seat, Phil? Where? Right there should be fine. Philip half collapsed to the ground as Dan stepped out from behind his light. He kept Betty trained on his new acquaintance as he turned the brightness down on the lantern. Whoa, Philip said as he saw the rifle in Dan's hands. You don't need that. I'm not doing anything. Just a little safety measure for us both, Phil. That's all, Dan said as he sat back in his camp chair. Now, who was chasing you? I don't know, Philip said as he stared towards where he had just come through the trees. What do you mean you don't know? Dan asked. You seem awful worked up over it. Of course I am, Philip said, raising his voice. Look at me, I'm bleeding. Yeah, Dan said, but that looks like a whole lot of blood for just running through some trees. Philip lowered his head and stared at the ground. What do you say, Phil? Is that all from just you? No, Philip said, almost too quiet to be heard. What was that? Dan asked. Philip snapped his head up and glared at Dan. What the hell, man? He shouted at Dan. I was just looking for someone to help me. Why are you treating me like some sort of criminal? Oh, I don't know, Phil, Dan shot back. When some strange guy comes screaming through the forest in the middle of the night, busts into my camp all covered in blood, I get a little anxious. Can you help me feel a little less anxious, Phil? I don't know, Philip replied. I'm a student. I study entomology at Washington State. Where'd all the blood come from? Dan asked. Philip looked at his hands, which were covered in the stuff. Must be from Professor Lewis. We're looking for moths. Oh, did a moth attack your professor, Philip? What? No, I don't know, Philip stuttered. I think I must have fallen asleep, but then these really weird noises woke me up, like branches breaking or something. I couldn't see anything, and then something grabbed me, and I got knocked over. And then I just got up and I started running, and maybe it was a bear? Philip looked up at Dan, his face full of fear and confusion. Dan sighed and began to lower his guard, but just a little. He stood from his camp chair and leaned Betty back up against her tree. You think a bear attacked you? He asked as he retrieved his canteen and handed it to the rattled young man. I guess it's possible, but not likely. Where are you keeping your food at? Oh, we've been hanging it, Philip said as he fumbled with the canteen. Lewis knows how to do everything. He's been coming up here for years. Professor Lewis, well, we have to help him. Philip got to his feet, nearly dropping the canteen in the process. Dan stepped forward and put a hand out to help steady the young man. Hold up there, big guy, he said, resting his hand on Philip's shoulder. Drink some water, get yourself together, and then we'll see about your professor friend. Philip held up the canteen with both hands, took a long drink, and then wiped his face against his arm. He stopped, held his arm out, and stared at it. Oh, my God, he said softly. This is his blood. He's hurt. We have to go help him. We have to... Slow down, Phil, Dan said as he collected his canteen. Does your professor friend have any weapons? Anything to defend himself with? Maybe a pocket knife, I think? No guns? Dan asked. No, Philip answered. He would never have a gun. The young man was cut off by a sound that instantly sent shivers up his spine. A howl that echoed from deep in the trees. What the hell was that? Philip asked, his eyes like saucers. Was that a wolf? Are there wolves up here? He turned and stared at Dan, his mouth hanging open. I'm not sure what the hell that was, Dan said quietly, but it wasn't any damn wolf I've ever heard. He quickly returned Betty to his shoulder and then turned off the lantern. What are you doing? Philip asked, his voice trembling. How are we supposed to see anything? Hush, Dan commanded. Your eyes will adjust, and there's enough moonlight to see just fine. Dan grabbed Philip by the shirt and pushed him behind a tree as another howl pierced through the night air. Something between a human snarl and an animalistic scream. It was a sound that both excited and terrified Dan. Your professor friend was not attacked by a bear, and that ain't no wolf neither. Dan explained as he kept his hand on Philip's chest. He could feel the man's heartbeat through his shirt. The poor boy might have a heart attack at this rate. I came up here looking for something, Philip, and I think I know what got your friend. What are you talking about? Philip asked. Dan turned and smiled. You ever seen a Bigfoot, Phil? He asked very plainly. Philip was caught entirely off guard and stood with his mouth hanging open. I'm sorry, what? He finally asked. Bigfoot, Dan replied. You know, Wendigo, Sasquatch. Wait, Philip stammered. You're not serious. Oh, I'm dead serious, Dan said. It's why I'm here. I'm going to bag the bastard, drag his ass down this mountain, and put him in front of someone who matters. No, something attacked Professor Lewis, Philip said, the volume of his voice slowly increasing. It probably killed him, or he's laying there in a pool of blood waiting for us to come help him, and you are babbling on about Bigfoot. I'm not crazy, Phil. I'm not crazy. And yeah, if your buddy got attacked by one of these things, he's probably dead or dying. But if we go running off into the trees, in the dark, it'll probably get us too. Wouldn't you rather we get it instead? Philip stared at Dan and then slowly shook his head. This is ridiculous, he said. Professor Lewis did not get attacked by a Bigfoot. It was a bear or a wolf or, I don't know, a wild cat or something. A wild cat, Dan scoffed. Not likely, Phil. And Dan was interrupted by another ungodly howl. It was getting closer. And does that sound like a cat to you, Phil? I don't know, Philip spat back. I'm not terribly familiar with the sounds of wild animals, but moths don't do a lot of howling. I've spent a lot of time out here, my friend, Dan said, amongst the trees and the wild things. And never before have I ever heard a sound like that. Dan's eyes locked with Philip's, and Philip could tell this man was serious. It didn't mean he wasn't crazy, but he at least believed what he was saying. What makes you so sure? Philip asked. Why a Bigfoot? Because I've seen one before, Dan answered plainly. Like I said, I've spent a lot of time out here, and 8 years ago, I saw one. You saw one? Philip asked, forcing himself not to roll his eyes. Okay, what did it look like? We don't have time for this, Dan said. It's getting closer, and Bigfoot or not, it's going to find us out here. No. Come on, Philip pushed. You're telling me you saw one of these things. What did it look like? What did your Bigfoot look like? Fine, Dan snapped. Maybe I only caught a glimpse of it through the trees, but I saw what it did. I saw what the thing was capable of. And what the hell is that supposed to mean? Philip asked mockingly. It got a hold of a mule deer. You ever seen one of those? Smaller than an elk, but bigger than a whitetail. This one must have been about 250, 300 pounds, easy. It was split from its chin to its groin and laid out on the trail like a butterfly or something, like one of your moths. It was almost artistic. It was purposefully taken apart, not torn apart. I must have scared off whatever had killed it, and I saw it taken off through the trees. It wasn't a bear, and it wasn't a man. It was something in between. Dan went silent and looked at Philip. Another howl broke the silence. It was much closer now. So what do we do? Philip asked. Well, for whatever reason, it stopped chasing you before, but seems like it might be interested in finding you again. You think it's coming after me? Philip asked. Well, yeah. Why else do you think it's getting closer to my camp? Probably picked up your scent or something. And you know what? You're going to lead it straight to me. Once again, thank you so much for joining me for this 14th episode of Storytime with Mr. C. That was the first half of my latest spooky story, Wild Within. And you will have to wait until next week for part 2, which will be available on October 12th. I am then hoping for a couple more weeks of spooky stories to get us ready for Halloween, and then on November 2nd, we will start with the stories of the matriarchs. So please stay tuned for all of that. Also, tell me what your plans are for Halloween. Are you dressing up? Decorating the house? Let me know. I love this stuff. In the meantime, send me some new material too, and go check out Ben's podcast, Chasing the Whimsy. Thanks again for hanging out and listening to my story. Hope you come on back for the next one. Until then, take care. Be safe.